What happens when a proud new teacher chooses the wrong janitor to insult? Mary had quietly served Westwood School for over 30 years, cleaning every hallway and classroom with a humility that earned her the respect of generations of students. She had witnessed countless innocent children grow up to become doctors, lawyers, and even confident teachers. Mary had seen kindness blossom and cruelty fade away with time. She stood quietly amidst the changes, holding on to her silent strength and boundless compassion. But Mary had never met someone like Richard Calloway, a man who carried the arrogance and darkness of prejudice, a man who believed that his power allowed him to belittle others, especially someone like her. Mary gently pulled her familiar cleaning cart, silently walking down the long, empty hallway of Westwood High School. Over 30 years had passed, yet she still maintained this routine, starting her day with the first light of dawn to ensure that each classroom was fresh and clean before the students arrived. At 62, her shoulders were beginning to ache. Her legs no longer moved as swiftly as they once did, but her eyes had never lost their warm, kind gaze. Mary was a small black woman, with gray hair tied neatly at the back of her head. The passage of time had left deep wrinkles on her face, but those wrinkles only made her smile all the more gentle and approachable to every student. For generations of students and teachers at Westwood, Mary was not just an elderly janitor, she had become a symbol of kindness and boundless compassion. It was said that she remembered the names of every student, from the seniors preparing to graduate to the nervous sixth graders entering the school for the first time. She always had a friendly greeting, an encouraging glance, or a soft smile that could ease the tension of a long day of learning. For many students, simply encountering Mary in the hallway, hearing her sincere words of encouragement, was enough to replenish their strength and help them keep going. Whenever a student faced difficulties or setbacks in life, whether small or serious, they would instinctively seek out Mary. Perhaps they knew she would never judge them, nor dismiss any pain they might be going through. She would always listen, understand, and gently comfort each young, wounded heart. Not only the students, but even the teachers and parents held Mary in special regard. They respected her not for her position or role, but for her dedication, noble character, and the quiet sacrifices she made for the school. Perhaps no one at Westwood had ever lived without receiving Mary's help at least once in their lives, whether through a small gesture, like lending a coat to a boy who forgot his on a cold winter day, or offering a few words of advice to a young teacher feeling stuck. For Westwood, Mary was like the silent soul of the school. She didn't have a large office or a fancy nameplate, but throughout the hallways, classrooms, library, and sports fields, the mark of her love and kindness was always evident. And Mary continued to quietly do her work, never feeling inferior or self-conscious about her station. She knew where her worth lay. It wasn't in degrees or titles, and it certainly wasn't in her skin color or status. It was in the smiles of the students, in the heartfelt thank yous she received each day. Mary, the small black woman, was the one who preserved and nurtured the spirit of Westwood. But she never imagined that the peaceful atmosphere she had maintained for over 3 decades would soon be violently disrupted by the arrival of a man carrying darkness and sharp prejudices. This was the beginning of the turbulent days that even Mary, the keeper of Westwood's soul, had never expected. But the peace that Mrs. Mary had maintained for over 3 decades soon began to falter when Westwood welcomed a new history teacher, Mr. Richard Calloway. Richard Calloway arrived at the school with a polished, sophisticated appearance, but with a cold, inscrutable demeanor. At 45, he had the look of a confident intellectual, with sharp, assessing eyes that always seemed to be silently evaluating everyone around him. Behind his expensive suit, his face often carried a barely concealed air of arrogance, and particularly a half-smile, full of mystery, lingered on his lips, making others feel uneasy whenever they were near him. Not long after Mr. Calloway arrived at Westwood, rumors began to spread quickly, like oil stains in water. Teachers in the school whispered about his murky past. Some said he had been dismissed from 2 previous schools, both times due to unacceptable racist comments and actions, alongside reports of him bullying and psychologically harming several students. No one knew the truth of these rumors, but Richard's attitude and behavior from the first day at Westwood raised concerns. His disdain was immediately directed at Mrs. Mary, the respected black janitor of the school. On his first morning at the school, as Mrs. Mary was cleaning the hallway near the history classroom, Richard stopped right in front of her, giving her a condescending look from head to toe, and asked in a cold tone, "Who are you to be working right in front of my classroom?" Mary looked up, offering a gentle, friendly smile. "Hello, sir, I'm Mary, the janitor for this hallway area. I'll finish quickly so it won't interfere with your class." He smirked, replying with a tone full of contempt. "Oh, so you're the janitor? I thought this school would hire people more carefully." That remark was like an invisible knife cutting into Mrs. Mary's heart, but she merely smiled, lowered her head, and continued with her work, hiding the fleeting sadness that had crossed her eyes. It didn't stop there. In his very first meeting with the entire staff, Richard Calloway made the atmosphere tense when he casually remarked, "It seems the standards at Westwood have seriously dropped if janitors are treated the same as teachers. Maybe the school should reconsider this." His words immediately created an unsettling silence. All eyes turned toward Mrs. Mary, who stood quietly in the corner of the room, a rag in her hand. Despite the awkward position, Mary kept her kind smile, suppressing the pain she had learned to endure throughout her life. But when Richard unintentionally caught her gaze, instead of feeling guilty, he smiled lightly, as though the hurt he had just caused was perfectly natural. In that moment, Mary realized that the man standing before her was not merely arrogant and tactless. He was the embodiment of prejudice, of discrimination that she had hoped had long been left behind. In the days that followed, Richard Calloway continued to sow sharp words and subtle but cutting disdain throughout the school that had once been her safe haven. Mrs. Mary could not help but feel uneasy, not only for herself but also for all the innocent children at Westwood. The shadow of Richard Calloway's past began to fall over Westwood, silently creeping into every corner, threatening the values that Mrs. Mary had worked so hard to protect. But she couldn't yet know that the real storm was still ahead, and the battle against this toxic racism would be far more fierce than she could ever have imagined. Since the first day he appeared at Westwood, Richard Calloway had always felt a strange discomfort whenever he saw Mrs. Mary quietly working. He couldn't understand, nor did he want to understand, why a black janitor was given so much respect at such a prestigious school. To him, the value of a person must be tied to their status, position, and skin color. This belief had been ingrained in him since childhood, and over the years, it hadn't changed much. Richard grew up in a wealthy conservative family in the South. His parents always reminded him that people would only respect you if you held power and a higher position than them. Therefore, he always tried to climb as high as possible, to be in the top position, to have the right to judge and control others. This mentality quickly led him to success in his teaching career, but it also caused him to be driven out of several previous schools due to his racist attitude and bullying of students. When Richard first arrived at Westwood, he brought these prejudices into every action and word. Ironically, the thing that made him most uncomfortable was Mrs. Mary, the revered janitor, who only knew how to clean the hallways, classrooms, and bathrooms every day. Perhaps it was her calm demeanor, gentleness, and the respect everyone had for her that hurt his enormous ego. Richard could not accept the fact that Mrs. Mary was so loved by both students and teachers. In his eyes, this was a reversal of values, an outright insult to the worldview he had always followed. Every morning, when Richard arrived at school, he felt disturbed seeing students waving at Mary from afar, the joyful looks in their eyes, and the friendly greetings whenever she appeared. This discomfort grew, tormenting him, turning into a silent hatred directed straight at this small woman. Then, one afternoon, when the teaching day was over, Richard walked into the teacher's lounge. The atmosphere in the lounge was lively, with everyone relaxing after a long day, chatting happily over coffee. Mrs. Mary was also there, holding a broom and sweeping around the tables. The teachers in the room were still conversing with her as usual, and this only made Richard more irritated. Standing in the middle of the room, Richard cleared his throat loudly, enough for everyone present to notice. When all eyes turned to him, he smiled coldly, scanned the room with a scrutinizing gaze, and slowly said, "It's surprising to see all of you still treating an old black woman sweeping floors as if she were on par with the teachers here. Is Westwood really so lacking in decent people to respect that it has come to this?" His words fell into the room like a cold stone, freezing all laughter and conversation. The joyful atmosphere immediately gave way to a tense silence. The teachers present began exchanging uncomfortable, awkward glances. Some bowed their heads quietly, others shook their heads in confusion. Richard Calloway crossed his arms in front of his chest, still staring directly at Mary, waiting for a reaction. To him, she was nothing more than an inferior, a target for him to publicly humiliate in order to show everyone where true value lies. After a brief moment of silence, Mrs. Mary gently raised her head and directed her familiar kind gaze toward Richard. She did not show anger or panic, but calmly placed the broom down, smiled gently, and replied serenely, "Mr. Calloway, respect does not come from occupation or skin color, but from how we live and how we treat those around us. I'm sure everyone here understands that, including you." As soon as she finished speaking, the room seemed to calm down in a miraculous way. The looks that were once full of hesitation now secretly turned to Mrs. Mary with admiration. A few younger teachers smiled softly, sensing the power in the calm, profound words of the elderly woman. Richard suddenly felt as if he had been struck a painful blow to his pride. The composed and dignified response from Mrs. Mary made him feel deeply offended. To Richard, it was not just a simple reaction, but a clear declaration of war, a challenge he could not easily ignore. "Oh, how noble! I didn't expect you to be so good at theory, Mrs. Mary," Richard replied coldly, trying to maintain a calm face, but inside he was burning with anger. "However, I'm afraid that no matter how well you speak, you'll still just be a cleaner, nothing more." With that, Richard turned and walked out of the room, leaving no chance for anyone to say anything further. His footsteps echoed down the hallway, resounding in the heavy silence he had just left behind. Mrs. Mary stood still, her gaze following Richard's retreating figure with concern. She knew this was not just a casual remark from someone with an inflated ego. Deep down, Mary understood that Richard's hatred had become more serious, more dangerous. The peaceful days of hers and the Westwood school would soon be tested by the hatred and prejudice he brought. And in that brief moment, Mary silently reminded herself that the battle against injustice and discrimination would be fiercer than ever. But she was undeterred, for she knew she was standing on the side of what was right, on the side of compassion, something Richard Calloway could perhaps never understand. After that afternoon, the atmosphere at Westwood School began to change noticeably. Though the conversation between Mrs. Mary and Richard Calloway lasted only a few minutes, its impact quietly spread throughout the hallways, classrooms, and even within the hearts of those who witnessed it. Mary returned to her usual work quietly, but she could not help but feel the growing unease within her heart. As for Richard, ever since Mary had responded to him calmly, he became far more irritable. His arrogant ego had been deeply wounded, turning into an unpleasant obsession that gnawed at his mind. In Richard's twisted thinking, Mary's existence and the respect others showed her were humiliations toward him, things he simply could not accept. From his initial public taunts, Richard shifted to more subtle actions, quiet yet far more cruel and dangerous. He began spreading poisonous words in private conversations with colleagues. Whenever the opportunity arose, he would cleverly add a few degrading remarks about Mrs. Mary, implying that other people of color were no better. His seemingly innocent words slowly seeped into the minds of those who overheard them, building up over time. One morning, while sipping coffee with a few other teachers in the break room, Richard casually remarked with an air of indifference, "It's hard to understand why so many people here are so kind to an old black woman cleaning the school. I wonder if it's genuine kindness or just a way for you to feel better about yourselves." The teachers present fell silent, uncomfortably. No one dared to directly counter his words, fearing to upset the newly arrived colleague. Richard was well aware of this and took advantage of their silence to push his toxic words even further. Not long after, he no longer hesitated to use his own classroom as a vehicle for spreading this poison. In history lessons, he began inserting covertly racist remarks, linking historical failures to the supposed inferiority of certain ethnicities, particularly emphasizing the weaknesses of those of African descent. He often sarcastically told the class, "As you can see, history always proves that each race has its limits. Some ethnicities will never rise above the lowly position society has assigned to them." His words made the black students in the class feel awkward and ashamed. They became more hesitant when answering questions, gradually losing the confidence they once had. Richard silently reveled in the change in their behavior, because in his distorted mind it meant his views were being tacitly accepted. Richard's toxicity didn't stop in the classroom but spread quickly throughout the hallways and the school grounds. One day, while he saw Mrs. Mary cleaning near the library, he purposely raised his voice with another teacher. "Be careful. Who knows if she's even cleaning properly? To me, all I see is more dirtiness." The remark was loud enough for Mrs. Mary to hear clearly, but she remained silent, only lowering her head as she continued with her work. Inside, her heart ached, but Mary kept reminding herself not to let him hurt her any deeper. Those words could cause pain, but she understood her worth and believed that others around her understood it too. However, her silence and endurance only enraged Richard further. To him, it was a covert challenge, a sign that Mary still maintained the dignity he was trying to break. Richard became bolder, seizing every opportunity to demean her in front of others. The atmosphere at school grew heavier. Other teachers began to clearly feel the tension Richard was bringing. The black students became more withdrawn, often lowering their heads to avoid his gaze when they crossed paths in the hallways. The younger teachers were confused, unsure of how to confront Richard's increasingly overt, discriminatory behavior. Some teachers began to worry and quietly discussed whether they should report Richard's actions. However, the fear of causing internal conflict or upsetting their new colleague made them hesitant and reluctant to take decisive action. As for Mrs. Mary, despite enduring the insults every day, she always kept a calm and confident demeanor, never responding to Richard again. She decided to quietly observe, holding on to the inner strength within her heart, waiting for the right moment to put an end to this toxicity. But Mary understood that if she didn't act soon, Richard would not stop. He would only cause more serious harm to the innocent children studying at Westwood. She felt the pressure growing heavier on her shoulders, and she knew that sooner or later she would have to stand up firmly to protect the school, which she had always considered her second home. In the darkness that was slowly enveloping Westwood, Mary silently prayed, hoping she would find the courage to face the brutal challenges ahead. For she knew that the battle against the prejudice and hatred that Richard Calloway brought would be the longest and most painful fight she would ever face in her life. The toxicity of Richard Calloway was no longer limited to just subtle remarks. When he realized that Mary and the other teachers' silence was seen as weakness, Richard grew more confident in pushing things further. He felt as though he was winning, and that only fueled his desire to publicly and aggressively prove his distorted views. Westwood, a school where students once felt safe and respected, began to transform into a place where prejudice and tension seeped into every corner. Students of color felt the pressure every time they walked into Richard's classroom. His cold, mocking tone and discriminatory comments made them increasingly fearful and withdrawn. Daniel, an 11th grade black student, was one of them. Daniel had been well known at school for his politeness, good manners, and outstanding academic achievements. He excelled in math and science, and had a passion for history. For Daniel, every class was an opportunity to explore the vast world around him. He always asked thoughtful questions and showed genuine interest in every lesson. But since Richard's arrival, Daniel had felt confused and uneasy. Every time he entered the history classroom, an invisible weight seemed to press down on his shoulders. Daniel had overheard Richard's cruel remarks about Mrs. Mary and other black students, and that made him lose the confidence he once had. Each time he spoke up, he became more hesitant and self-conscious than ever before. Then, one day, during a fateful class, the last straw was reached. It was a sunny October morning. Richard stood at the board, holding a history book, his cold eyes scanning the students as if searching for a target to unleash his frustrations. Midway through the lesson, he unexpectedly directed his gaze toward Daniel and asked him a question about World War I. "Daniel, can you tell the class what the direct cause of World War I was?" The question wasn't too difficult, but in that moment Daniel froze. Richard's harsh words from the past suddenly flooded his mind, overwhelming him. Daniel could feel dozens of eyes on him, making him so nervous that he lost the ability to think clearly. I think it was the economic conflict between nations." Daniel stammered, his voice trembling and lacking confidence. Richard silently shook his head, a malicious smirk creeping onto his lips. His eyes glinted with disdain, clearly seizing the opportunity to hurt Daniel. "Daniel, I'm not surprised that someone like you doesn't understand anything. I've always thought that kids like you are good at sports, but when it comes to academics, it's hopeless." Those words were like a knife piercing through Daniel's heart. He stood frozen, his eyes wide in shock and humiliation. A few small laughs echoed through the classroom, though some classmates also felt sympathy and discomfort for Daniel. He felt like the world was collapsing around him, all his years of hard work disappearing in the face of the blatant humiliation from a teacher he had once respected so much. Richard remained at the board, coldly staring at Daniel. In that moment, he felt satisfaction from striking a blow at what he called the illusions of students like Daniel. To him, Daniel represented everything he despised and couldn't accept. A black student who excelled, challenging the narrow-minded prejudices Richard had clung to throughout his life. Daniel couldn't say another word. Tears began to well up in his eyes as he lowered his head in shame, silently sitting down in his seat. For the rest of the lesson, he could hear nothing except for the faint, haunting laughter from earlier. As soon as the bell rang, Daniel rushed out of the classroom, avoiding the curious and pitying stares of his classmates. In his pain and panic, Daniel could only think of one person he could turn to: Mrs. Mary. He ran down the hallway, tears streaming down his face. When he saw Mrs. Mary, her familiar figure cleaning the hallway in the distance, Daniel dashed toward her like a child searching for a loved one after a panic attack. "Mrs. Mary, I. Daniel choked, unable to finish his words. He broke down in tears, burying his head in her shoulder. Mary froze for a moment, taken aback, but she quickly understood what had happened. She embraced Daniel, gently comforting him, letting him cry out the pain he had just endured. "It's okay, Daniel. You haven't done anything wrong. You're stronger than his words," Mary whispered, but in her heart, anger flared up fiercely. She knew that Richard had crossed a line and she couldn't stay silent any longer. In that moment, Mary decided she had to stand up to protect Daniel, to protect all the children at Westwood from the discrimination, hatred, and toxicity of Richard Calloway. She understood that this was not just a fight to protect her own dignity, but a fight for what was right, for justice, for the true values of the school. And this time, she wouldn't stop until the truth and compassion were restored, and no child would have to endure the same suffering as Daniel ever again. In that moment, when Daniel burst into tears and buried his head in Mary's shoulder, her heart felt as though it was being squeezed tight. The hot, trembling tears of the obedient teenager poured out like relentless waves crashing against Mary's soul. She didn't speak right away, but gently wrapped her arms around Daniel, soothing him, allowing him to cry and release the humiliation and deep wounds he had just endured. "You haven't done anything wrong, Daniel," Mary spoke softly after a brief silence, her voice gentle, as if trying to heal his emotional pain. Daniel sobbed, his shoulders shaking uncontrollably, but her tender words made him feel safer, more protected against the cruelty of Richard Calloway. Why did he say those things to me, Mrs. Mary?" Daniel asked through his tears, his voice full of despair. "I've never done anything to make him hate me like this. Why does he look down on me just because of the color of my skin?" Mary paused for a moment, her heart heavy with sorrow. She knew the answer to Daniel's question, but how could she tell a child, so full of pain, the harsh truth about the reality of life? How could she explain that there were people like Richard Calloway whose hearts were clouded by the darkness of hatred and prejudice? She sighed softly, her gaze kind yet resolute. "Daniel, the world isn't fair, and sometimes there are people who let hatred and prejudice control their lives. But you have to remember that what he said doesn't reflect your true worth. You're never inferior just because he says so. What matters is that you believe in yourself, believe in your own dignity. Don't let his cruel words break you down." Daniel looked up at Mary, his eyes filled with tears, but also a deep sense of gratitude. In his darkest moment, Mary was the only person he trusted enough to open his heart to. And now, her words felt like a faint light guiding him back to a sense of peace in the storm that raged within his young heart. "But I don't know if I'm strong enough," Daniel whispered, his voice so soft it was almost inaudible. Mary gently wiped the tears from his cheek, offering a warm smile. "You're stronger than you think, and you're not alone. I'm always here for you, as are your friends and all the other teachers. We'll get through this together." In that moment, Mary realized more clearly than ever that she couldn't remain silent anymore. Daniel wasn't the only student suffering from Richard's cruelty. She knew that if she didn't act, those poisonous words would continue to spread more suffering to innocent students at Westwood. Richard Calloway had crossed the line. He was no longer just a man with prejudice. He had become a bully, spreading fear and hurt in the hearts of students he was supposed to protect and teach. Mary knew exactly what she had to do next, even though she understood it wouldn't be easy. The fight with Richard was no longer just a personal confrontation between the two of them, but a battle to protect the values she had spent her life nurturing at Westwood: kindness, fairness, and the self-respect of every child attending that school. She looked at Daniel once more, her resolve growing stronger in her heart. His tears and pain were the clearest proof of Richard Calloway's danger, the final drop that had overflowed Mary's patience. From this moment forward, she wouldn't allow anyone, especially Richard, to continue harming these innocent children. "Daniel, promise me you'll stay strong, okay? You won't let his words bring you down," Mary said gently, her eyes filled with determination and hope. Daniel nodded slowly, wiping away his tears, his gaze becoming stronger than before. "I promise, Mrs. Mary," he said in a firmer voice, as if finding some strength in her words. Mary hugged Daniel once more, then gently encouraged him to return to class, reminding him to keep faith in himself. She stood alone in the quiet hallway, her heart both pained and strengthened. She knew the upcoming battle with Richard Calloway would be incredibly difficult, but this time she would not back down. Deep in her soul, Mary vowed to do everything in her power to protect Daniel and the other innocent children. She knew that if she remained silent, she would be at fault for letting Richard's cruelty continue to harm children like Daniel. Mary's fight now wasn't just about protecting her own dignity, but also to protect the values of goodness and humanity at Westwood, the school she had spent 3 decades nurturing with love and care. And this time, she had decided to step out of the shadows, to face Richard Calloway with strength, to permanently stop the harm he was causing to the children she loved as her own. After Daniel's figure disappeared behind the classroom door, Mary stood alone in the empty hallway, her heart still aching from the tears of the young student. She had never felt so heartbroken and angry before. Having spent 3 decades at Westwood, Mary had witnessed countless events, many awkward situations, but never had she felt such a powerful pressure driving her to take a stand like she did now. For the first time in her life, Mary clearly understood that if she remained silent, many more students would have to endure the same pain that Daniel had just gone through. That whole morning, Mary quietly went about her work as usual, but in her mind, Daniel's red eyes and his wounded face kept flashing before her. She couldn't let this go. She had promised herself that today she would no longer stay silent. Her battle with Richard Calloway was no longer just a personal matter. It was about self-respect, justice, and the children she had considered her own over the years. When the bell rang to signal the start of break, Mary decided to head towards the history classroom, where Richard was standing, chatting with a few other teachers in the hallway. Each of her steps was slow, calm, yet resolute. A few students curiously watched her, sensing that something unusual was about to happen. Richard stood in the hallway, confidently chatting, his face beaming with smugness, showing no remorse or regret for the things he had done. When he saw Mary approach, he merely gave her a condescending smile, clearly unimpressed by her presence. "Mr. Calloway," Mary spoke in a calm voice, loud enough to catch the attention of everyone around her. Both teachers and students turned their gaze toward her. The space immediately became tense and silent. Richard raised an eyebrow and looked at Mary with his usual disdainful attitude. "Is there something you want, Mrs. Mary? I don't think we have anything to discuss," Richard replied sarcastically, his lips curling in a challenging grin. A few teachers around them felt uncomfortable, but were also curious to listen. You do not have the right to insult Daniel or any other student. Your racist remarks are hurting this entire school," Mary said strongly, her eyes unwavering as she looked directly at Richard, making it clear that she would not back down any longer. Her words rang out clearly, each one affirming her authority and righteousness in front of everyone present. A few students nodded quietly, silently admiring this small but strong woman. Richard hesitated for a moment at Mary's unexpected, forceful response, but quickly regained his usual arrogant expression. He laughed loudly, mocking her. "It's touching that you think you have the right to speak up, but I'm afraid you're mistaken. You're just a janitor. You have no place judging how I teach my students. Just stick to cleaning the floors." A few quiet chuckles came from the students watching, making Mary feel hurt, but this only strengthened her resolve. This time, she would not let those degrading words make her back down. "Mr. Calloway, the value of a person is not measured by their status or skin color. I may just be an old black janitor in your eyes, but at least I have never hurt anyone with hateful and unethical words like you," Mary responded calmly and firmly, causing the earlier laughter to fall silent. People began to realize the seriousness and strength in her words. Richard gritted his teeth, anger rising within him. For the first time, someone he had always looked down upon dared to openly confront and challenge him in front of everyone. This made Richard feel deeply insulted, but he forced himself to stay calm, sneering once more to hide the fury that was building inside. "Well done, Mrs. Mary, truly an outstanding actress. But unfortunately, an old janitor like you will never change anything in this school. The truth is the truth, and I will continue to teach students the way I want." Richard coldly turned his back and walked away, not giving Mary the chance to respond. He deliberately walked quickly, as if to show her that this confrontation was over and he was the winner. However, inside, he began to feel more uneasy than before. He had never expected this small woman to stand up against him so boldly, something he had never encountered in any other school. Behind him, Mary stood still, watching Richard's retreating figure, her resolve unwavering. She knew that this was only the beginning of a long and difficult battle ahead. But at least now, everyone in the school understood that she would no longer remain silent. Mary had made the decision to step into the light to protect her students, to safeguard the values she held dear at Westwood, even though she knew that from now on she would have to face even greater challenges from Richard Calloway, the man full of hatred and prejudice. After the tense confrontation with Richard Calloway, Mary stood alone in the hallway, acutely aware of the curious and sympathetic gazes of the students and teachers around her. Richard had stormed off, his anger carefully masked beneath an arrogant expression, but Mary knew the battle was just beginning. His challenge still echoed in her mind like a menacing warning. "A janitor like you will never change anything." Quietly returning to her cleaning duties, Mary wondered if Richard was right. After more than 30 years at Westwood, she had never imagined she would become the center of such a complex conflict. But now, all that remained in her heart was resolve. She could not, and would never, accept seeing any more children harmed by the prejudice or cruelty of that man. That very afternoon, Mary decided she wouldn't act hastily or impulsively. To confront someone as clever but devious as Richard, she would need to prepare thoroughly. The only way to protect the students and herself was to gather undeniable, clear evidence of his racist behavior and bullying. In the following days, Mary became quieter than usual, carefully observing and listening. She used the small phone her daughter had given her for Christmas to record Richard's condescending remarks whenever he lectured or conversed with colleagues. Each cruel, racially charged comment he made was meticulously documented. Mary didn't stop at just recording. She quietly spoke with other teachers, particularly those she knew were discontented with Richard's actions, but had lacked the courage to speak up. At first, no one wanted to confront Richard directly. Everyone feared the consequences, feared displeasing him, and feared disrupting the stability of their daily lives. But when they saw the courage and determination in Mary's eyes, they began to feel inspired. One by one, they started to open up, sharing what they had witnessed. Times when Richard either intentionally or unintentionally displayed racial prejudice, belittled black students, and insulted Mary. These stories were carefully documented by Mary, forming a thick dossier filled with alarming truths about a toxic teacher like Richard. The testimonies from young teachers like Susan, Thomas, and even students in his class all revealed the same truth. Richard Calloway was not only prejudiced but also a cunning bully who used his power to hurt the more vulnerable. Among the students Mary spoke with was Daniel. Although it pained him to recall the incident, Daniel recounted everything that had happened in class that day with a trembling yet resolute voice. Mary's heart tightened as she listened to Daniel say, "I've never felt so scared and ashamed, Mrs. Mary. What he said made me think maybe I'm just not good enough." Mary gently held Daniel's hand, comforting him with a warm yet determined smile. "Daniel, you are not at fault here. Trust me, what he said is the real wrong." After each session of collecting evidence or testimonies, Mary would quietly return to the small room where she rested after work. In the dim yellow light, she spent hours listening to the recordings, reading over the heartbreaking testimonies, and reliving the moving stories of each teacher and student. The more she listened, the more she realized that if she didn't stand up now, no one else would have the courage to do so. Mary recognized that her strength did not lie in the power or position she held, but in the truth she now possessed. These pieces of evidence were the most powerful weapon she could wield against Richard Calloway, but she also understood that he wouldn't give up easily, and this battle would be incredibly difficult. A week later, Mary had gathered all the necessary evidence. She carefully organized the file, holding the phone with the recorded segments in her hand, her heart both anxious and determined. It was time to bring everything to light and end the harm Richard had caused to Westwood students once and for all. In that moment, Mary knew she was stepping into a real battle. She wasn't just confronting an individual, she was challenging an entire system steeped in subtle biases. But she also knew she wasn't alone. Behind her stood the truth, justice, and especially the innocent children who were waiting for her protection. Mary stood up, took a deep breath, and whispered to herself that this would be the last time she allowed anyone to harm the students she considered her own. From this moment on, she would never back down until justice was truly restored for Daniel, for herself, and for the beloved Westwood school she had dedicated her life to nurturing and preserving. On the day of the emergency meeting at Westwood School, the atmosphere grew tense from early morning. The large meeting room at the end of the hallway, usually quiet, was today filled with curious and worried glances from teachers, parents, and even members of the administration. Everyone understood that this was not just an ordinary internal meeting. It could determine the future of many people, and more importantly, the fate of the prestigious Westwood School. Richard Calloway walked into the room with his usual confident demeanor, his eyes quickly scanning the crowd before he sat down in his designated seat at the large conference table. His face remained calm, as though this meeting posed no real threat. To him, the baseless accusations and rumors of an old janitor couldn't possibly have any serious impact on his position at the school. He was certain that his power and status as a teacher would be enough to protect him from anything. The meeting quickly began under the leadership of Principal Peterson, a man known for his composure and rare display of emotions. After stating that the purpose of the meeting was to address the troubling reports of racial discrimination and bullying at the school, Peterson turned to Richard with a serious expression. "Mr. Calloway, we've received several reports about your inappropriate behavior and remarks during class. Is there anything you'd like to address before we continue?" Richard chuckled lightly, feigning surprise and innocence. "Principal Peterson, I'm sorry for any misunderstandings. I always work with the utmost responsibility and have never intended to offend anyone. Perhaps someone is trying to create false stories against me." His words rang with confidence, causing a few members of the parent council to exchange concerned glances. But just at that moment, the door to the meeting room suddenly swung open, and all eyes turned to the person who had just entered. It was Mrs. Mary. She walked in calmly, her face kind yet determined. In her hands was a thick folder and the small phone she had used over the past days to record Richard's cruel words. Her unexpected appearance left Richard stunned, and the smile on his face immediately froze. "Sorry for interrupting the meeting," Mary said softly, her voice clear yet firm. "But I believe I have important evidence that the board needs to review before making any decisions." Principal Peterson nodded slightly, granting her permission to continue. Mary walked up to the table, gently placing the folder in front of everyone, then opened her phone to prepare to play the recordings. Richard's confident demeanor quickly faded as he furrowed his brow in confusion and anger. "What is this, Mrs. Mary? I don't understand what you're trying to do." Mary looked straight at Richard, her gaze unwavering. "Mr. Calloway, these are your own words in the classroom and in conversations at this school. It's time for everyone to know the truth." Without giving Richard a chance to respond, Mary played the first recording. Richard's cold voice was clearly heard throughout the meeting room. "Daniel, I'm really not surprised that someone like you doesn't understand anything. People like you are only good at sports, but hopeless when it comes to academics." The cruel words echoed in the room, leaving everyone stunned. Some parents and teachers exchanged shocked glances, stunned by the truth that had just been revealed. Richard's face turned pale, and he immediately stood up, vehemently denying, "This is a misunderstanding. This recording has been edited to tarnish my reputation." But Mary remained calm and played the second recording, Richard's voice once again clearly audible. "I don't understand why you all are so nice to that old black lady janitor. Or do you just want to reassure yourselves that you're not racist?" At this point, Richard's anger could no longer be concealed. He gritted his teeth, his eyes filled with venom as he glared at Mary, but she showed no fear and continued presenting her evidence. "In addition to these recordings, I've also collected testimonies from teachers and students. They are all willing to testify about Mr. Calloway's racist behavior and bullying." Principal Peterson, now completely serious, spoke up with a sharp tone. "Mr. Calloway, do you have any explanation for this clear evidence?" Richard looked around the room, desperately searching for support, but only receiving disappointed and angry glances in return. He felt the weight of his predicament, utterly powerless in the face of this undeniable evidence. However, his twisted pride kept him from admitting his mistake. He coldly responded, "I don't think I need to explain any further. I haven't done anything wrong. But if the board chooses to believe a janitor over a respected teacher, then I'm truly disappointed." Principal Peterson shook his head, his gaze even more stern than before. "Mr. Calloway, we will review this evidence thoroughly, but I must make it clear that what we have heard is unacceptable." Richard stood there, his anger, frustration, and helplessness evident in every gesture. Meanwhile, Mary stood still, a sense of relief slowly replacing her earlier tension. She knew that the battle wasn't over, but at least the truth had come to light. And in that moment, Mary knew she had done the right thing. The truth, justice, and courage had helped her overcome prejudice and darkness, lighting a new hope for the students in the beloved Westwood school. The tense meeting ended in a heavy atmosphere. As the participants slowly left the room, their eyes subtly turned toward Richard Calloway, who remained seated, motionless, his face dark, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and bitterness. He had never imagined that today would become the worst day in his proud teaching career. Just a few hours later, the decision to fire Richard was announced quickly and clearly. There were no more doubts or hesitations, as the evidence presented by Mrs. Mary was too convincing. Richard's teaching career at Westwood officially came to an end, leaving him alone to face the harsh reality that he could no longer escape. That afternoon, Richard quietly packed his belongings in his small office. Gone was the arrogance he once had, and his face now was a chaotic mix of emotions: anger, hatred, and a bitter sense of failure. He packed hurriedly, not wanting to stay a moment longer in this place. The only thought in his mind at that moment was pure hatred for Mary, whom he had always considered inferior and worthless, but who now had made him pay with his entire career. Walking down the hallway with a box of personal items in his hands, Richard could feel the covert, yet full of hatred and contempt, gazes from the teachers and students who had endured his toxicity. He pretended not to see, walking with a forced strength, but the shame that was rising in his heart felt like an unstoppable wave. At that moment, Richard realized that he had lost everything: his pride, his reputation, and the respect he had once thought he deserved. As he passed through the Westwood school gate for the last time, he turned to look back, trying to maintain a cold expression, but inside he was filled with resentment. It was here that he had once thought he could control everything, using his power and position as a teacher to impose his twisted ideas on others. But in the end, the person who defeated him was just an old janitor, someone he had mocked and despised countless times. Richard got into his car, started the engine, and drove off quickly, as if trying to escape the place that had just given him the most painful defeat of his life. No farewell, no regretful glance, only a lingering, bitter feeling following him like an inescapable shadow. Behind him, the Westwood school stood silently in the afternoon sun, as if breathing a sigh of relief after finally being rid of the person who had caused so much pain and harm. Yet, the toxic marks Richard had left were not so easily erased. The damage he caused to the students, especially Daniel and many other students of color, remained, quietly existing in every glance and young heart. Mary stood silently by the second-floor window, watching as the car's shadow gradually disappeared. Though she felt relieved that Richard had left, she knew this was not a complete victory. There was still much work to be done, for the emotional wounds of the students needed time and patience to heal. The cruel words, the disdainful glances Richard had sowed, all left deep scars in the hearts of the children she loved as her own. Young teacher Susan approached Mary, gently placing her hand on Mary's shoulder and speaking in a soft yet sincere voice. "Thank you, Mary. If it weren't for you, we still wouldn't have had the courage to stand up for our students." Mary smiled gently, her gaze distant with concern. "We did the right thing, but the journey is still long, Susan. The wounds he caused will take time to heal." Susan nodded, her eyes showing determination. "We'll do it together. No child should have to suffer the way Daniel and the others have." Mary looked at Susan with eyes full of hope and gratitude. In that moment, she felt the unity and true strength of the community at Westwood. She understood that, despite all the suffering they had endured, as long as there were people willing to stand up for what was right, The best things would surely return to this place. But just then, Mary's eyes briefly caught sight of Daniel standing quietly alone in the schoolyard. The small student still carried the burden of the pain Richard had caused. It was the clearest reminder to her and everyone that the fight was not truly over. Mary descended to the schoolyard, walking toward Daniel with a familiar, kind smile. "Daniel, are you okay?" she asked gently. He looked up at her, his gaze still heavy but less tortured. "I feel relieved that he's not here anymore, Mrs. Mary. But I still don't know how to get over what he said." Mary placed her hand on Daniel's shoulder, gently but firmly. "We'll get through this together. I promise you." Daniel gave a weak smile, but with trust in his eyes, and Mary knew that the promise she had just made was not just for him, but a commitment to herself and the school she loved so deeply. Richard Calloway had left in disgrace, but the journey to heal the wounds he had left behind was only just beginning, and Mary knew that she, along with everyone at Westwood, would need to be even stronger to move beyond the darkness, toward a brighter future, one where there was no place for hatred and discrimination. Although Richard Calloway's car had long disappeared from the gates of Westwood School, the darkness of the toxic words he left behind still lingered. Standing in the schoolyard, Mary could feel it intensely as she looked into the eyes of Daniel and the other children. Innocent children, still struggling with the silent pain in their hearts. Daniel had become more withdrawn after what had happened. Once an active, confident student, now he always kept his head down as he walked through the halls, avoiding the curious gazes of his peers. It seemed as if Richard's cruel words from that day still echoed in his mind, leaving him without the courage to stand up and speak in class anymore. The lessons that once brought joy and excitement were now just moments of heaviness, filled with pressure and self-doubt for Daniel. It wasn't just Daniel. Many other students of color at Westwood were in a similar state. Richard's racist remarks were like deep cuts, leaving behind psychological scars that quietly gnawed away at their confidence and self-esteem. The school, which had once felt like a safe, proud place for them, now suddenly seemed alien, filled with unspoken anxiety and fear. Mary was very aware of this. She knew that even though Richard had left, the marks he left behind would not be easily erased. The wounds the students were suffering from required healing through time, patience, and above all, genuine love and support from the school community. One afternoon, after school, Mary noticed Daniel sitting alone on a bench in the corner of the schoolyard. He had his head down, his vacant eyes fixed on the ground, as if trying to avoid the gaze of the entire world around him. Seeing this, Mary quietly approached him and gently sat down beside him, not speaking immediately, but allowing Daniel to feel the peaceful presence she offered. "Mary," Daniel whispered after a few minutes of silence, his voice soft and hesitant, as if trying to hold on to the last bit of confidence he had left. "I thought everything would get better when Mr. Calloway left, but it still feels so hard. I can still hear his words every time I try to speak in class." Mary sighed softly, placing her hand gently but firmly on Daniel's shoulder. "I understand, my dear. Those wounds aren't easy to forget right away. But you must remember one thing. The things he said are not the truth, and they cannot define your true worth." Daniel looked up at her, his eyes brimming with tears. "But how can I believe in myself again, Mary? I'm afraid people will always look at me with that same gaze, always think of me as inferior." Mary gently shook her head, her eyes full of love and deep understanding. "Daniel, your worth is in your heart, in how you live and how you treat others. No one can take that away unless you let them. Those hurtful words can only harm you if you allow them to control your mind." Daniel remained silent for a long time, as if deeply contemplating her words. Mary could feel the fierce inner struggle within him. She understood that, to overcome these psychological scars, Daniel and the other students needed more than just personal encouragement. They needed the support of everyone at Westwood. And from that day on, Mary decided she would not just stop at offering personal words of comfort. She began engaging more with the young teachers, those willing to join her in healing the wounds Richard had left. She suggested organizing extracurricular activities and informal chats with students to help them regain their confidence and erase the wounds caused by discrimination. In the days that followed, Mary consistently appeared at various school activities, gently encouraging each student, always patient in listening to their stories, their concerns, and even their small dreams. She constantly reminded every student that they all deserved respect, love, and to be proud of themselves, regardless of their skin color or background. Gradually, thanks to Mary's perseverance and sincerity, many students began to rediscover their confidence and belief in themselves. Daniel slowly grew stronger, beginning to find his voice again in class, gradually overcoming the haunting words of Richard Calloway. Seeing the slow but noticeable progress of the students, Mary understood that the journey of healing was still long, but at least she and the other dedicated teachers had started moving in the right direction. The fight against discrimination and hatred did not end when Richard left the school. It would last forever, every day, in the way she and everyone treated one another. For Mary, this was the most important job she had ever undertaken in over 30 years at Westwood, a task that wasn't in any job description, but was more meaningful and valuable than anything else. Because she knew that only when the emotional wounds were truly healed would Westwood truly become a safe and happy place for all students, no matter who they were, where they came from, or what color their skin was. After witnessing the deep psychological wounds left by Richard Calloway in Daniel and many other students' hearts, Mary knew that soothing and healing those pains could not be accomplished overnight. Driving Richard out of Westwood was just the first step. The hardest and most important task still lay ahead. From that day forward, Mary quietly became a guide for the students, a reliable pillar that anyone in the school could turn to whenever they felt lost, confused, or had lost faith in themselves. Not only Daniel, but also his other friends, the students of color who had been victims of Richard, gradually sought out Mary, silently sharing the pain they had kept hidden in their hearts. Fully aware that the students needed a safe space to express their thoughts and emotions, Mary began setting aside time to organize small, private conversations after school. These could take place on warm afternoons beneath the old tree in the corner of the schoolyard, or sometimes just short but sincere chats in the school corridor. With each meeting, she never rushed the students to forget their hurts quickly. Instead, she chose to listen, to understand, and gently guided them to find their own sense of self-worth. One afternoon, as the gentle golden sunlight stretched across the small courtyard, Mary and Daniel sat together. She looked at him with a gentle yet firm gaze and began the conversation softly. "Daniel, do you know that in the 30 years I've worked at Westwood, I've met so many wonderful, talented, and kind-hearted children?" Daniel was a bit surprised. His eyes still carried some hesitation, but they softened as he heard Mary's familiar voice. "Really, Mrs. Mary?" "Yes, really. And you know what? You are one of those wonderful children. I've watched you grow day by day, helping your friends, doing your best in school. The cruel words that Mr. Calloway said to you were nothing but lies. They don't reflect who you truly are." Mary gently placed her hand on Daniel's shoulder and looked deeply into his eyes. Daniel fell silent. His gaze dropped to the ground as if trying to hold back tears. "But why did he say those things, Mrs. Mary? Is it because I'm not really good enough?" Mary gently shook her head, her eyes shining with certainty and love. "No, Daniel. He said those things because his heart is full of prejudice and hatred. You are never responsible for someone else's cruelty. The most important thing is that you understand who you really are and where your true worth lies." Daniel stayed silent for a moment, then looked up at Mary, his eyes seeming to brighten a little. "Mrs. Mary, I really want to believe what you're saying. I want to believe that I still have a chance to prove myself, that I am not what Mr. Calloway says." Mary smiled kindly, her heart warmed and strengthened by the small courage that flickered in the eyes of her beloved student. "You don't just have a chance, Daniel. You always have the right to be proud of yourself. What he said can never change the fact that you are a smart, kind, and strong child, and no one, not even Richard Calloway, can take that away from you." Conversations like these became more frequent at Westwood. Not only Daniel, but many other students also found encouragement, comfort, and endless inspiration from Mary. Gradually, little by little, she gently guided them out of the darkness of self-doubt and insecurity, helping them see their true value and overcome the deep wounds left by racism. Ms. Susan and many other young teachers at the school also eagerly joined Mary. They worked with her to organize group activities, encouraging students to share their stories, dreams, and beliefs. The atmosphere at Westwood slowly returned to one of kindness, love, and unity. Under Mary's devoted guidance, the wounded little hearts began to heal. Daniel returned to class with a gradually renewed sense of belief, starting to raise his hand to answer questions again, daring to look his friends and teachers in the eye with a confidence he thought he had lost. One afternoon, Daniel approached Mary with bright eyes. "Mrs. Mary, today I answered the history question correctly, and I don't hear Mr. Calloway's cruel words anymore." Mary smiled with relief, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I always knew you could do it. You see, the real strength has always been inside you." In that moment, Mary understood that the work she was doing to heal these wounded hearts was the most meaningful thing in her life. It wasn't about revenge, nor about proving who was right or wrong, but about restoring dignity, pride, and belief in the true worth of each child she loved. And as she looked around the schoolyard, witnessing the genuine smiles returning to the students' faces, Mary knew that Westwood was gradually recovering, thanks to the persistence and love that she and everyone were building together. The emotional wounds were being healed day by day, and the Westwood school she loved so much was slowly becoming a safe, happy place for all the students. A place where every student deserved to be proud of themselves. The quiet days of sowing seeds of love and healing the wounds of the soul that Mary dedicated to Daniel and his classmates were finally beginning to blossom. Little by little, the confidence and self-respect, which had been crushed by Richard's cruel words, gradually returned to the bright eyes of the students. Especially Daniel, the obedient and intelligent boy who had gone through the darkest times of his life, was now starting to stand firm on his own feet, regaining the strength he had lost. No longer did he hide from the gaze of others or bow his head in silence during class. The Daniel of today was a strong, more confident young man, beginning to dare ask bold questions, to debate, and to express his views clearly and decisively in class. One late afternoon, after the bell rang, Daniel stayed behind in the classroom, waiting for Miss Susan to leave. When he was alone, Daniel walked up to the window, gazing down at the schoolyard where Mary was silently cleaning. In his heart, he felt an immense sense of gratitude for that small but resilient woman. Daniel understood that it was Mary who had helped him get through the hardest time, when the hurtful words from Richard almost brought him to his knees. The day of the final semester's closing ceremony arrived. The atmosphere at Westwood High was lively and festive as students, parents, and teachers gathered in the large auditorium. Everyone eagerly awaited the moment of awarding prizes and hearing speeches from the outstanding students. And the one standing on stage at that very moment was Daniel. When his name was called, the whole auditorium erupted in applause. Daniel slowly walked up to the podium, his gaze confident and clear, a stark contrast to the shy, fearful boy he once was. Mary's heart swelled with pride and emotion. She stood at the back of the auditorium, silently wiping away tears of happiness as she saw Daniel, now fully confident, facing the eyes of hundreds. Daniel took a deep breath and began speaking clearly and sincerely. "Hello, everyone. My name is Daniel, and I stand here today to share a story that I think I must tell." The auditorium fell silent. Everyone focused on listening. Daniel continued, his voice strong and full of emotion. "As you all know, our school has recently gone through a difficult period due to prejudice and racism from a former teacher here. I was once a victim of those words, and I used to think that I would never be good enough because of the color of my skin." His voice caught for a moment, but Daniel quickly regained his composure. "But then, in my darkest moments, I found the strength to rise up against those cruel words, and the person who gave me that strength was Mrs. Mary." Daniel looked directly at Mary, who was standing quietly at the back of the auditorium. Their eyes met in a moment full of emotion. "Mrs. Mary showed me that a person's worth does not depend on the color of their skin or their social status. She taught me that I deserve respect, I deserve love, and I have every right to be proud of myself. Thanks to her, I found the strength to keep trying, and I am able to stand here today." The auditorium erupted in applause, with many students and teachers moved to tears by Daniel's heartfelt speech. Mary stood at the back of the room, tears silently running down her cheeks. She had never expected gratitude or praise from anyone, but in that moment Daniel's words truly moved her deeply. Daniel turned to face the other students, continuing with an inspiring voice. "I share this story not to talk about the pain I went through, but to remind us that everyone deserves to be treated with respect and love. We should never let harmful words and discrimination destroy our belief in ourselves. Always have the courage to stand up, because only courage can help us overcome all prejudices." Daniel finished his speech to a long, resounding round of applause from the entire auditorium. Miss Susan walked up to the stage, placed her hand on Daniel's shoulder with pride, and cast a grateful glance at Mary. In that moment, everyone understood that Westwood had truly overcome the darkness that Richard Calloway had sown. Mary, the small woman who had silently endured insults and discrimination, had now become a symbol of courage and love at Westwood. Not through power or status, but through her integrity, sincerity, and persistence, she had helped heal the wounded hearts of the students. Daniel left the stage and walked straight toward Mary, embracing her tightly, whispering, "Thank you, Mary. You saved me." Mary smiled, gently patting Daniel's back. "You saved yourself, my dear. I just believed in you." And in that moment, she understood that the courage she had passed on to Daniel and all the students at Westwood not only helped them overcome their painful pasts, but was also planting the seeds for a brighter future, where everyone could live in love, unity, and where there was no room for discrimination or hatred anymore. After Daniel's emotional speech, the atmosphere in the Westwood Hall became warmer than ever. As the last rounds of applause gradually faded, everyone turned to look toward Mrs. Mary, the small, humble woman standing silently in the corner of the room. Mary felt a little shy under the warm, admiring gazes of the students and teachers, but she also knew that all these beautiful moments were not meant solely for her, but for something much greater, That was kindness, courage, and unity in the face of injustice. From that day, the story of Mary quickly became the most valuable lesson in the hearts of every student at Westwood. The new students entering the school were told the story of the elderly black janitor who bravely stood up against prejudice and racism to protect her beloved students. The name Mary became a vibrant symbol, reminding everyone of compassion, humility, and most of all, the courage to protect the righteous values of life. As time passed, Mary continued her daily cleaning work as before. However, every day she entered Westwood, she was always greeted with warm hellos, thankful smiles, and respectful glances from both students and teachers. It made her feel incredibly warm inside. For Mary, there was nothing more meaningful than seeing the students grow up in an environment full of love and respect, free from the shadow of false prejudices. One afternoon, as Mary finished her work and prepared to leave the school, she was surprised to see a group of small students gathering around the large wall near the schoolyard. Curious, she slowly approached, and when she saw what was in front of her, her heart suddenly tightened with emotion. On the large wall at the entrance to Westwood, a beautiful and vivid portrait of her had been painted, with a large bold inscription underneath. No one has the right to harm others just because they are different. Every person deserves respect, and we must always stand up to protect that. Mary stood still, deeply moved by this meaningful message. She never thought that her small actions could have such a profound impact. Daniel stood nearby, smiling as he walked over to her, proudly whispering, "Mrs. Mary, this is a gift from all the students of Westwood. We want to thank you for always being there, protecting us, and teaching us courage and faith." Mary looked at Daniel, tears silently rolling down her cheeks. She gently responded in a soft and humble voice, "I'm only doing what anyone should do, Daniel. All of you deserve love, protection, and respect. If I've left anything behind, I only hope it's the courage for you all to continue standing up for what's right." From that day, Mrs. Mary's message became an invaluable legacy, always present in every corner of Westwood. Every student absorbed the lesson that a person's worth is never dependent on skin color, profession, or social status. That compassion, courage, and determination to fight against injustice are what truly define a person's value. Even after Mary retired a few years later, her story continued to be mentioned every day at the school. Teachers and students of Westwood kept the invaluable spiritual legacy that Mary had left. They not only remembered her as a dedicated janitor, but also as a simple hero who helped them understand that true strength lies in the heart and in courage. Then, Daniel grew up, graduated, and left Westwood, but he carried Mary's message with him throughout his life. Daniel became a young man who always fought against prejudice and injustice, reminding those around him of the precious lesson that Mary had once taught him. Many years later, when Mary was old and sitting quietly on the porch of her small house, she still received letters, photos, and sincere thank you notes from generations of former students. They told her about their lives, about what they had done to continue spreading her message around the world. In a letter sent one late winter afternoon, Daniel wrote, "Dear Mrs. Mary, even though I have grown up and gone far, the message you left behind has always been my guiding star. I still believe that a true hero doesn't need a cape or power, but only a courageous heart and genuine love, just like you." Those words made Mary smile, peacefully and happily. Her life might have been simply that of a humble janitor, but she knew she had done the most valuable thing, leaving behind a spiritual legacy that would live on in everyone's hearts. In the end, the core message of Mrs. Mary's story and Westwood School has always been repeated. The true value of each person is not based on their skin color, profession, or social status. A true hero is someone who courageously stands up against injustice, protects dignity, and plants seeds of confidence and pride in the hearts of those hurt by prejudice and discrimination. That is the most meaningful gift, the greatest legacy Mary has left for the world. The story of Mrs. Mary is not only a journey against injustice and racism, but also a powerful reminder that each of us can become a real hero as long as we dare to stand up for what is right and spread love and courage to everyone around us. And what about you? Have you ever witnessed or faced a similar situation? And what would you do to stop discrimination and bullying in your own school or workplace? Please share your thoughts and experiences with us in the comments below. If you enjoyed this meaningful story, don't forget to like, share the video with more people, and subscribe to our channel to help us spread positive messages in life. Thank you for always being with us. See you in the next stories.